Mattingly.
And I'm Grace.
And welcome to our Psychological Approach Crash Course on Charlotte Bronte's famous novel,
Jane Eyre.
Thank you.
Next, Jane Eyre was published in 1848 during the Victorian era. There were obvious Gothic and romantic themes throughout the novel, which influenced the characters and settings. Throughout the different aspects of the book, we can take a psychoanalytical approach to better understand the characters as portrayed by Bronte, and what this expresses about herself, as well as analyze each individual reader's response.
So, Freud's work, and Freud is the creator of the psychoanalytic process. His theories are widely known, and one of his most famous is the theory of the tripartite self, which involves the id, ego, and superego. And basically, he says that all complex human behavior can be then traced back to the tripartite self. Also, in accordance with this theory,
Dr. MacLeod, who is a psychoanalytical researcher at the University of Manchester.
They both corroborate the idea of the id, ego, and superego. The id is described by both as a primitive and instinctive, impulsive, and more unconscious behaviors, and it is not affected by reality. Then there is the ego, which is described by Freud as the part of the id modified by the direct influence of the external world. And Freud kind of sees it as the mediator between the impulsive id and the more realistic superego. And he says it's like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. So Freud kind of sees the ego as driving the id in the correct direction. Then there finally is the superego, which is mostly like values and morals, things like that. And it's like the strive for perfection, and it consists of the conscious and the ideal self. And it's largely also determined in childhood, which we see a lot of in Jane. Okay, so side note, another famous theorist is Bowlby, who created the attachment theory, which is described by him as a lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. So basically he defines it as the attachment a child has to its mother, kind of that parental attachment and so on. So basically he believes that when the child is not exposed to this attachment theory, like this personal parental guidance, during the first 5 years of childhood, it is suggested that the child then would suffer irreversible developmental consequences such as increased aggression, which we find to be very evident in Jane's character, especially as being influenced by her childhood with the Reeds. In the novel, there are many forces motivating the characters, everything from religion and love,
Morals, social status,
to cultural norms, everything like that, both the unconscious and conscious decisions and behaviors. Through these various forces and motivations, we can apply a deeper analysis using Freud's tripartite personality traits, which is the id, ego, and superego. We can characterize each person's behaviors as unconscious or conscious. Things like morals, religion, and wealth can be assigned as conscious, or the ego, superego section, and then functions like desires and fears and denial and projection can be classified as unconscious decisions, or more relating to the id. So this is a quote that Jane uses to describe her love for Rochester. What do I sacrifice? Famine for food, expectation for content. To be privileged to put my arms around what I value, to press my lips to what I love, to repose on what I trust. Is that to make a sacrifice? If so, then certainly I delight in sacrifice. So through this quote, we can understand more of the different forces that are motivating Jane. Like, obviously we see her morals and all of these things kind of taking shape as she's further developed during the novel, but what she finds to be the most important ends up being her love for Mr. Rochester, right, Grace? Yeah, right?
Yeah, true love.
True love. So next we have a quote describing Jane.
She is clever enough to be a governess in a high family, Papa.
So this quote kind of just shows what was valued during that time, and it kind of shows more of the motivations. She said she could be working in a high family, which obviously it was important to be societally correct and to be as high as you could be in society. So that goes to show. Then we have another quote that Rochester describes of Bertha.
Her family wished to secure me because I was of a good race.
That again gives some more motivations and how back then it was valued to be superior and like societally superior as well. So, many of the characters, as we can see, actually do correspond to Freud's tripartite self theory. For example, we have Jane, who is able to mostly contain her desires and stay true to her morals, which we kind of see through her denial of St. John and initially denying Rochester of marriage, and throughout the story as well. But in the end, she still ends up following her heart's desire, which we see as Rochester. And this is kind of her superego part, was exemplified by her guilty feelings and like attempts to try and be the perfect person and follow this perfect moral code. But we can kind of see her id and her ego, and all of three of them kind of come out and play a role in her behaviors and personality. Then we have Bertha, who mostly exemplifies the id aspect, which is the unconscious part of her personality. She acts instinctively, this is especially portrayed through Bronte's writing, and especially with her meeting of Jane and
tearing her veil.
Yeah, tearing her veil, setting Rochester's bed on fire, all of her animalistic characteristics, and we can all just see that through the way Bronte portrays her. Then there's also Helen, who presents a more of a superego approach to her personality. She's very religious, which goes back to the superego aspect, and she wants the best for everyone and expects only the best from herself, which is kind of like striving for that perfection, which is also the superego. So we have a quote of Helen.
One strong proof of my wretchedly defective nature is that even her expostulations, so mild and rational, have not influenced to cure me of my faults. Even her praise, though I value it most highly, cannot stimulate me to continued care and foresight.
So she obviously highly values her moral side, but she also, evident in this quote, has the id part, which she also has to deal with, and her desires and everything. And also her desire to make everyone kind of fit more into her characteristic type. Then we have Rochester, who represents all three, as most of them do, and it shows he kind of lives off his morals, but he also strives to be societally correct. He also, however, challenges the customs of the time, and like by following his desires for Jane, so that's kind of again that mix up between ego, superego, and id. And then lastly we have St. John, who is also much like Helen, portrays the superego aspects. He's very religious and follows a strict moral code. Everything he does is to relate back to his religion. He still, however, does have a passion for what he does, and he has a deep desire for Jane to follow in his path. So the same conscious and unconscious, which is like id, ego, superego, labels can also be applied to the conflicts between the characters as well, which we also kind of saw earlier. Specifically, there's Jane and Rochester, which shows the unconscious conflicts between their love for each other and like their desires, as well as the conscious conflicts like their morals and their social status, which is evident to both the reader and themselves. Then we have Jane versus the Reeds, which is more the conscious conflicts, like conflicts over the morals and social status, which is obviously like portrayed through the superego and behaviors and everything of Jane, and both the Reeds and Jane. Then there's also Jane and Brocklehurst, which is also more of a conscious conflict, and it kind of exhibits more of this religion and contrasting morals, which is more superego, and the same can also be said for Helen. So, based on Freud's theories, that is, like the id, ego, and superego, the tripartite self, and Bronte's characterization, the character's behavior was, personally, we thought very plausible. Every action had a reason, which as the reader is easily detectable when psychologically analyzing the novel. For example, we use Bertha. Bertha's description, which presents her as a villainous character and like very bad and evil, makes her previous and later actions, like we described earlier, the fire and the veil and like the attack, very predictable, especially when considering her more id-focused personalities.
Thanks for tuning in with us. Now for Jocelyn and Lindsay.
A psychological approach can reveal Charlotte Bronte's influences writing the novel, as her work was impacted by her life in many ways.
Jane goes through many of the struggles that Charlotte went through.
Jane is an orphan who is sent away to a boarding school where she does not have a pleasant childhood.
Bronte is proposed to 3 times and declines 2 of the offers, just like her Jane is proposed to more than once in the book, and in the end goes with Rochester, not St. John. But Bronte's experiences with marriages might be why it plays such a big role in the novel.
Jane Eyre reflects the unconscious dimensions of the writer, Bronte, through through loss and how she chose to incorporate that through the story of Helen Burns. The reader's personal psychology can create a bias towards characters such as Rochester or Bertha Mason due to their own personal history and experiences.
What role does psychological disorders play? Well, the obvious example of that is Bertha Mason, Rochester's mentally ill wife that he keeps locked up in an attic.
His treatment of her reflects the Victorian mentality regarding mental illnesses, which is that they are shameful and should be hidden.
One thing that magnifies this is the fact that Bertha is a woman, meaning she is of even lower status than a male psychological patient would be.
Keep going.
Bertha's mental disorder makes her a violent person, and she's portrayed as fearful and disgusting.
Also, the characters can be seen as psychological types. Jane can be seen as an introvert, as she is energized after spending time alone and is less socially awkward.
Mr. Rochester could also...
Let me redo that line. Start again from the beginning of this line.
Okay. One thing that magnifies this is the fact that Bertha is a woman, meaning she is of even lower status than a male psychological patient would have been. Bertha's mental disorder makes her a violent person, and she is portrayed as fearful and disgusting.
Also, the characters can be seen as psychological types. Jane can be seen as an introvert, as she is energized after spending time alone and is a less social person.
Mr. Rochester could also be seen as an introvert, as he does not like spending time with very many people, and is very inward focused.
One extrovert in the story is Adele. She is very outgoing and likes the company of the other people.
How can male and female readers view this book differently? A female would relate more directly with Jane and the inequality she faces and feel more sympathy for Bertha.
Now time for an open letter. This is a letter from Maria. Dear Crash Course, how can rereading this as a woman affect my analysis of this novel as one about seeing Jane Eyre as a woman who fears motherhood, whose nightmares reflect the anxieties of the average Victorian woman? Well, Maria, reading this as a novel about the fear of motherhood can reflect one's personal psychologies and how it may affect their analysis of the book. As well as a male reader could potentially feel less connected to the story since its main male character does not narrate.